The beginning of the war in Ukraine, the European Union has radically reduced its imports of coal, oil and natural gas from Russia. In fact, the bloc's stated goal is to eliminate all Russian fossil fuel imports by 2027. But there is one glaring exception to this trend: liquefied natural gas, or LNG, which the EU has been importing in record volumes from Russia.
The European Union claims to stand against Russia, but is secretly fueling their war machine. While they impose sanctions and condemn Putin's aggression, the EU continues to pour billions of euros into the Russian economy through the continued purchase of Russian liquefied natural gas, or LNG. You won't believe how much Russian gas the EU is still buying. Despite imposing sweeping sanctions on Russia, the EU remains deeply reliant on Russian energy. In fact, in 2024, EU imports of Russian LNG surged by a staggering 27% year-on-year, constituting a shocking 20% of the EU's total natural gas intake. This blatant contradiction highlights the EU's inability to reconcile its lofty geopolitical ambitions with the harsh realities of its energy needs. Countries like Slovakia, Belgium, Spain, and France have become key enablers of this dependency. Slovakia alone imported more Russian fossil fuels than any other EU country, while Belgium's purchases totaled a staggering 223 million euros in just June 2024, solidifying its place as a top buyer of Russian energy. Even Spain and France, despite their vocal support for Ukraine, have continued substantial imports, underscoring the glaring gap between rhetoric and action. A December report from the Center for the Study of Democracy, CSD, concluded, although Russian fossil fuel exports to the West have decreased, glaring loopholes in the sanctions regime persist. Nowhere are the failings more prominent than with liquefied natural gas, LNG. In 2024, the EU imported a record 16.5 million metric tons of LNG from Russia, surpassing the 15.2 million in 2023. To be fair, some EU countries, led by Germany, have done much to truncate their Russian energy dependencies. According to a Belgian think tank Bruegel, the EU slashed its imports of Russian fossil fuels by 94%, from $16 billion per month to around $1 billion per month, between early 2022 and the end of 2023. However, some countries across the bloc are still buying energy supplies from Russia and thus paying straight into Russian President Vladimir Putin's war chest. The EU's excuses for this energy betrayal are crumbling. They claim a lack of immediate alternatives, citing high global demand for LNG and insufficient infrastructure to source exclusively from non-Russian suppliers. But critics argue this reveals a fundamental lack of long-term planning and a failure to prioritize energy independence. For years, the EU has neglected to invest in alternative energy sources, leaving itself vulnerable to geopolitical blackmail. When it comes to Russian LNG, which is not sanctioned and remains a bargain compared to imported US super-chilled gas, Europe has even regressed. According to the Financial Times, EU countries' imports from Russia, led by France, Spain, the Netherlands, and Belgium, reached an all-time high in 2024. But how does the EU energy purchases directly fund Putin's war machine? Well, the continued flow of cash into Russia's coffers allows them to sustain their brutal war effort in Ukraine. The Kremlin, emboldened by the EU's continued dependence, has ramped up its propaganda efforts, portraying Europe as weak and hypocritical. Russian state media gleefully points out the EU's dependence on its LNG, framing it as a victory for Moscow's resilience against Western pressure. Every tanker of LNG shipped from Russian terminals to European ports reinforces this dynamic, weakening the EU's credibility as a global leader against authoritarian aggression. Soaring energy bills are breaking European families. The EU's energy policy isn't just a geopolitical problem, it's a domestic crisis. The fallout of this dependence is being felt directly by ordinary citizens across the continent. As energy prices skyrocket, families are facing impossible choices: heat their homes or feed their children, keep the lights on or pay their rent. The average household electricity bill has doubled or tripled compared to pre-war levels, pushing many families to the brink. While the EU champions its sanctions against Russia and lofty declarations of standing with Ukraine, these measures have done little to shield ordinary Europeans from the fallout. Instead, they find themselves grappling with inflation, stagnant wages, and spiraling energy costs. Protests have erupted in cities like Paris, Berlin, and Madrid, where citizens demand their governments prioritize domestic stability over political posturing. For many, the war in Ukraine is seen as an issue that should concern NATO, the United States, and Eastern European nations directly involved. The average EU citizen, removed from the front lines, sees little justification for sacrificing their quality of life in a conflict they feel powerless to influence. The EU's own actions are tearing it apart from within. The continued reliance on Russian energy is not only fueling the war machine, but also creating deep divisions within the EU itself. Sanctions fatigue is setting in, with some member states pushing to ease sanctions on Russian fossil fuels. Populist parties in Italy, Hungary, and other countries argue that sanctions hurt European citizens more than they affect Russia. This rhetoric resonates with voters who see their government sending billions in aid to Ukraine, while their own living standards decline. The risk of sanctions fatigue looms large, threatening to fracture the EU's unified front against Moscow. Adding to these challenges are reports of shadow trade that undermine the EU's sanctions regime. Investigations have revealed fleets of tankers transporting Russian oil directly to European ports, often under the guise of shipments from third countries. These shadow fleets, operating through opaque ownership structures and flags of convenience registries, allow Russia to maintain substantial revenue streams despite Western embargoes. According to Stephanie Baker, author of Punishing Putin, Russia has been able to circumvent the restrictions to continue to earn billions of dollars from exporting oil, helping Putin finance the war. Baker further added that the fear of stoking inflation stopped the G7 from getting tougher on Russian oil sooner, and that allies could have sanctioned the shadow fleet more aggressively or lowered the price cap to drive down Russian revenues. Likewise, the United States could have threatened to impose sanctions on anyone involved in purchasing oil from blacklisted tankers. The latest sanctions, at least, are a step in the right direction. The lack of enforcement mechanisms to combat such practices exposes a glaring weakness in the EU's approach. Critics argue that, as long as these loopholes exist, the sanctions are little more than symbolic gestures. But here is an important question. Can the EU break free from its addiction to Russian gas? Firstly, Russia is still the dominant fuel and technology provider to much of Europe's nuclear power industry. It's one of the world's largest uranium producers and maintains control over 44% of the global uranium enrichment capacity. Almost 20% of Europe's imported raw uranium hails from Russia, and another 23% is of Kazakh origin, where Rosatom, a Russian nuclear energy corporation, pretty much runs the show. According to Bruegel, the absence of sanctions can be explained by, first, the EU's relative dependence on Russian nuclear fuel products, and second, the limited impact sanctions would have on Russia's trade balance. In 2023, the EU imported around $1 billion worth of Russian nuclear industry products. However, the United States is now taking the lead in putting this trade to an end. Before now, roughly 35% of U.S. nuclear fuel imports used to come from Russia. On August 12, however, the United States began restricting imports of Russian uranium products and will fully prohibit them by 1 January 2028. The EU's new energy commissioner, Dan Jorgensen, said the EU is also on the verge of sanctioning Russian nuclear imports, which the European Parliament has advocated for. With just a few weeks on the job, Jorgensen talks tough, pledging to drive forward the severance of all EU energy ties to Russia. Despite this, the EU's long-term energy strategy and the challenges ahead remain a major concern. While the bloc touts its ambitious Repower EU plan, aimed at phasing out Russian energy imports by 2027, progress has been slow and uneven. Many member states remain locked into long-term contracts with Russian suppliers, making it legally and financially challenging to pivot to alternative sources. Countries like Germany, which relied heavily on Russian pipeline gas before the war, face particular difficulties in reconfiguring their energy infrastructure. These contractual obligations mean that despite public statements to the contrary, Russian energy continues to flow into Europe, albeit indirectly. Now, on January 1st, 2025, Russian gas flowing to the EU via Ukraine stopped, marking the end of a decades-long arrangement that began in 1991. The European Union has said that the EU had prepared for the change and most states could cope. But Moldova, which is not in the EU, is already suffering shortages. Currently, the EU is not yet feeling the effects of the move. The strategic and symbolic impact for the whole of Europe is enormous. No doubt Russia has lost an important market, but according to Vladimir Putin, its EU countries will suffer the most. Aside from Ukraine, Russia can still send gas to Hungary, Turkey, and Serbia through the Turk Stream pipeline across the Black Sea. Slovakia's Prime Minister, Robert Fico, shares a similar view with Putin when he said that the end of the deal would have drastic consequences for EU countries, but not on Russia. So is the EU truly a global leader or a hostage to its own energy needs? The irony of the situation is hard to ignore. In its effort to punish Russia and support Ukraine, the EU has inadvertently inflicted pain on its own citizens while doing little to weaken Moscow. As long as the bloc remains unable to reconcile its moral stance with practical solutions, it will continue to stumble, caught between the competing demands of principle and pragmatism. In this precarious state, Europe's unity and credibility hang by a thread, threatening to unravel under the weight of its contradictions. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and share.